Hello, everybody. We're back again answering your questions about British Parliamentary Debate, its tactics, its strategy, and how to apply them. So today's question comes from another UH Manoa debater, in this case, Cindy Ng, who wants to know how and when to use burdens or to place burdens on your opponent in a British Parley round. I think this is a good question because burdens are not something that would come up when you're teaching beginning British parliamentary debate. And if we do mention burdens, we talk about the implicit and explicit burdens of role fulfillment. Specifically, when I'm teaching basic British parliamentary debate, I talk about the burdens each team has. Like, for instance, opening government has the burden to model effectively what the motion will be. They're to contextualize the motion, explain what the action being taken is, and then provide their positive matter to provide a justification for the motion itself. That's a burden that they definitely have. We talk about opening opposition that has a burden to present their own positive matter in opposition to the motion and to directly clash with side government. So those are burdens that you have. Another common burden is the burden of the whip, which is probably one of the unique functions of British parliamentary debate, in that the whip has a responsibility to summarize the round as well as to what I would call frame the round, to explain to the judge what the major conflict centers are and why their side is winning, right? And that's not a speech you see in other forms of debate because it's not a rebuttal. It's a speech of crystallization in a sense, though it can have rebuttal elements, particularly if it is closing opposition, because that will be their only opportunity to rebut. So there are rebuttal elements, I get that, but it is its own speech, and that's why I would say it's one of the more unique burdens that a speaker might have. Now, what I believe Cindy is referring to in this question, what I would understand a burden to commonly be in what you're doing, is it's a tactic that an individual can use to attempt to place a precondition on a team in the round, generally a team on the opposite bench, to win the round. Now, there's a couple of reasons why you might do this, but I first want to talk about why this may or may not be justified. So I will say first that I don't believe this is necessarily a tactic I like to use often. While I've been in many rounds where burdens are placed, I'm not generally the one who throws a gambit down. And the main reason why is if they meet the preconditions you set them, then you're basically arguing that they should win, or at least be better than you in the round, right? Rank above you. I don't like to give the judge a neat way to put my opponents above me, right? I don't see much of a benefit in doing that. So I'm not immediately the one doing this. Now, again, one of the things that burdens can really help with is clash on the long diagonal when you are on opening, right? So when you are on opening and you've already gotten your direct clash out against opening opposition, or even on opening opposition, you're getting your direct clash out against opening government, you want to be viewed as responsive to the rest of the teams in the round. But it's virtually impossible to do that because you're not going to get another chance to speak. And if they don't take your POIs, well, then you're going to get no time on the record after your speeches are done to provide any sort of argumentation that directly clashes with what back half is doing. And this is unavoidable because you don't know what back half is going to run until they run it. You have clues, but it's not set in stone. So in theory, unless your back half carries forward your argumentation and shows how it contrasts, and you get credit for this, you're not going to be seen as particularly responsive. And there are a lot of debate rounds where you're trying to be competitive in the long diagonal or the short diagonal, whatever. In both of those cases, putting a burden can be a nice thing, but you got to be careful about it, right? So that's what placing a burden is. It's placing a precondition on your opponent's victory before they have spoken. How is this justified, really is the question. It's justified if you're basically saying that in order to beat you, in order to address your argumentation, they would have to meet some sort of standard. So the most common way that I use a burden, when I do use it, again, not my favorite tactic, is I'd say, look, we've given you 4 to 5 contextualized examples of when X has occurred and it has gone well. In order for our opponents to beat us, they're going to need to show you multiple examples of it going wrong. Or, being realistic, I do it the other way around. We've shown you 4 to 5 examples of this not working in practice. They need to show us some examples of it working in practice rather than just the theory on why it's going to work. And again, if we're being realistic, we're probably talking about socialism, because that's probably my favorite burden to put on somebody. Okay, now the burden is on you to show me an example of a socialist government that has actually worked. So, full disclosure, that's the primary way in which I use burdens. Now, the reason why I like this is because it's not really fair. Like, I don't think you're going to get an example of a communist or heavily socialist government that has been successful in keeping the peace. The best thing you're going to get to do is use things like the Scandinavian model, which in reality are highly democratic market economies that have heavy social spending, which is not the same as socialism, and it's definitely not the same as communism. So I know that they can't possibly answer this burden, and it does seem to be fair in the sense that I'm saying, look, my primary argumentation is in the form of counterexamples. If you can provide examples that outweigh or are more pertinent than my counterexamples, you have defeated my argumentation. That's true. I'm not being unreasonable about that. But the reason why it's tactically strong for me to do it is because, well, I know they're not going to get the counterexample. So that's a safe way to do it. But again, is it justified? I find it to be justified only when there is a world in which they could meet this burden, where it is hypothetically possible for them to meet this precondition. Now, it doesn't have to be actually possible, because I would argue there has not been a communist government that has been successful in meeting the minimum standard of human rights and economic success and quality of life for its people for any amount of time. So it doesn't even have to be actual. It can be theoretical. So yes, my opponents in theory could provide me an example of a government. Now, contrast this with like an infinitely regressive burden, which is a term we use to describe a target that's always changing. Like once they give you an example, you place more conditions on it until eventually you realize you're never going to meet the standards. Like I'm not saying that it's okay. It's like, okay, you need to provide me an example and give specific GDP figures on how a socialist economy was better than a comparable capitalist economy in the same year in the same region. That is putting a ton of preconditions that don't meet the standard of evidence that we use in this debate, where you can't give me those specific numbers in British Parliament because we can't cite actual evidence or things that are outside of the general knowledge, so you're probably making it up. That's an unfair burden, that's unreasonable, and I wouldn't place it here. So I find that, again, a burden is justified when it's possible to meet the precondition, hypothetically at least, and the main reason to do it is to improve your engagement with the back half. You want them to try to take the bait, or and fail, or you want them to not take the bait and the judge noticed that you essentially threw out the gauntlet and they chose not to pick it up. That's a way of getting points. It's a way of cluing the judges into the fact that they avoided clashing with you when they should have done so. So that's when I would place a burden. I would do it in the deputy speech on opening government or opening opposition. More likely to do it on opening opposition, because if you throw a burden down on opening government in the deputy speech, in theory, the deputy leader of opposition can respond to it, and you're not really trying to engage with them. You're trying to engage with the back half that you can't otherwise do. What does it look like? In general, I use it to talk about examples. You're going to need to provide some sort of examples, or another way is to talk about if you're debating at different levels, right? If you're saying, look, they've given you a lot of practical examples. We've countered them by talking about the moral imperative. In order for side closing government to win, they have a burden to show us that it's morally justified to take such action. If they fail to do so, they haven't engaged with our primary argumentation, and thus they can't be in the round. So that's another way to do it. If you're arguing on a different level, to try to remind everybody that you'd like the debate to be done on this level, that you're winning the argumentation on this level. So that's essentially what a burden is in terms of placing it and using it as a tactic, and how it might be used. Again, as a caution, you got to be really careful about this, because if you underestimate your opponents and they can meet the burden, then you've given the judge every justification to give you the 4. And again, probably not the best debate tactic to dig your own grave. But with that being said, plenty of opportunities to do this, plenty of justifications to do it. Just be cautious.